Okay, as I talked about on Monday, the white allies of African Americans in the South, there were two groups. One was a group that most white Southerners regarded with contempt called carpetbaggers. This is what white Southerners called them contemptuously. And even today, the word carpetbagger is used to talk about an outsider coming into a troubled region to try to gain some good for himself, not or herself, not out of any sense of duty, but just out of sense of opportunity. And so these were Northerners. Many of them were ex-Union officers who wanted to live in the South, who aligned themselves with African Americans who thought that their cause was just. And the other group of whites was the group that I talked about, the scalawags, which were even more hated than the carpetbaggers. And these were indigenous whites, Southern whites, who aligned with African Americans. And they were hated because they were seen as traitors to their race. So what you have is you have the Republican Party in the South, beginning in 1867, particularly 1868, is made up of ex-slaves who have just received the right to vote under the protection of the U.S. Army, white males, of course, and their allies black males, of course. So you have black males, you have their white allies, the carpetbaggers, folks from the North that had come into the South after the war, or Union veterans who just stayed, and scalawags, white Southerners who lived in the region. This turned out to be a fairly weak alliance because it's greeted with just tremendous hostility by the white majority. The majority of Southern whites are just furious with what has happened. They're furious that there are new state constitutions that have been written that enshrine the 14th Amendment, which does, by the way, become a constitutional amendment under the Reconstruction Acts. They're furious that African Americans have some say in the political process. Some African Americans have been voted into legislatures. They're furious with the white allies of African Americans, the scalawags and the carpetbaggers. So it's a very, very tense time. And the Republican Party in the South, from really day one, just faces intense hostility by Northern whites. Northern whites regard the Republican Party, from their point, Southern whites, sorry, kind of stumbling and bumbling today. Southern whites regard the Republican Party in the South as an unholy alliance of ex-slaves, carpetbaggers from the North, and scalawags, race traders from the South. And they just view this group with intense hostility. And as we'll see, very, very quickly, this hostility turns to violence. So what you have is, beginning in about 1868, for a brief period of time, African Americans gain some say in the political process in the ex-Confederacy via the 14th Amendment, via the protection that these folks are given from the U.S. Army through the Reconstruction Acts. The record of African Americans in these state legislatures is, on the whole, I would say, positive. It's not perfect. There was corruption during this time, but there was corruption everywhere in the United States in the 1860s and 1870s. African Americans registered to vote, African American males anyway, in great numbers, even though whites tried to deter them. They served as voting registrars. They helped with the U.S. Army. They helped the U.S. Army in registering African Americans. And And then, after they wrote the Constitution, ratified the 14th Amendment, they moved in, at least a small portion of them, moved into the Texas legislature. And what was interesting is about the Texas legislature of 1869 is that it created a new constitution that guaranteed that one's political status could not be determined by race or color. Um, what you had, George guy by the name of George Ruby, African American politician, he was elected to the Texas State Senate. Matthew Gaines, who I talked about before, who was also an ex-slave, very significant in the founding of Texas A&M. He was also elected to the Texas State Senate as well. African Americans in the Texas legislature in 1869, in the period after blacks could vote, they created the first statewide financing of public schools. Schools had never been financed statewide before in Texas. There were 14 members, African American members of the 12th legislature in Texas. As I said previously, their highest priority was education. So they created an equitable system of funding schools. But it was just a very, very unpopular. The legislature, the 12th legislature that had African Americans in it, faced, as I said before, tremendous hostility from whites. Whites, when they looked at it, they viewed this as an illegitimate legislature that had been put in power through the bayonets of the U.S. Army. They didn't like the fact that the legislature was being very active, especially in terms of financing education. And very quickly, what you get in Texas and what you get everywhere else in the South is a violent counter reaction to the ability of African Americans to vote and the ability of African Americans to serve in state legislatures and in some cases in the U.S. Senate as well. By the way, once a state ratified the 14th Amendment, it then finally could come back into the Union. Okay, so states after 1867, after African Americans are granted the vote, after they create these new constitutions that approve the 14th Amendment, by 1870, almost all the states are back in the Union. They're back. They're sending representatives to Congress, to the Senate, and whatever their apportionment was to the House of Representatives. Okay, so what you have, though, is this violent counter reaction to black suffrage and African Americans serving in legislatures, aligned with carpetbaggers, so-called carpetbaggers, and so-called scalawags. And you have the creation of the Ku Klux Klan and other white terror groups. And they start, to the extent that they can, using violence against African Americans, burning down churches, capturing and whipping or murdering local black leaders, terrorizing the white supporters of African Americans. And at the same time, the people of the North just have grown tired of the problems in the South. They feel like the South, African Americans, that they've done enough for them, that they ended slavery, that they'd passed the 14th Amendment, that they'd given these folks the right to vote. And what you have is a waning of support for African Americans in the North, and a sense that the U.S. Army has to leave the South. So what happens is by the 1870s, the U.S. Army leaves most places in the South, and once they do, this opens the door for the Ku Klux Klan and other white terror groups to go in and completely undermine the gains made by African Americans during Reconstruction. So what you have is by 1876, whites regained control of legislatures in Texas, the legislature in the ex-Confederate states. So for a very, very brief period of time, from about 1868 to the early 1870s, African Americans gained real political power. But by the middle of the 1870s, through means of white terror, African Americans, this power slips from their hands. The U.S. government is no longer interested in having the Army occupy the South to protect African Americans and to protect their rights. And so this brief moment of African American power, it shuts, it ends by the 1870s. And within 2 decades after the 1870s, most African Americans, males who had gained the right to vote, have now lost the right to vote, and we enter into the Jim Crow era and the era of disenfranchisement that wouldn't end until the 1960s, about a century after the Civil War. So the Reconstruction period is what Eric Foner has called an unfinished revolution. It starts out with Confederate whites keeping power, but then they overreach. The Congress of the U.S. in 1867 goes in and forces Confederate whites to accept African Americans gaining the right to vote through the 14th Amendment. African Americans gain a voice in state legislatures. They send some politicians to the national legislature. They push especially for education programs in the South. But by the 1870s, through the means of white violence, what you saw valorized in Birth of a Nation, in a very racist way, the gains made by African Americans in the South start to slip away. And it's not until 100 years later, with the second Reconstruction of the 1950s and the 1960s, that African Americans are able to realize the fruits, especially of the 14th Amendment. Okay, so that's where I'm going to end this podcast. I think it's important to end kind of on a down note, that the emancipatory and the revolutionary aspects of the Civil War, although they flowered very briefly during the period of Reconstruction, take 100 years to be fully realized, and not until the 1950s and the 1960s. So the legacy of the Civil War, the short-term legacy is very mixed. Perhaps the long-term legacy is a bit more positive, but we still certainly deal with the racism that is a legacy of slavery. And I guess the last thing I'll say is something that I've talked about this semester. Although the Civil War ended slavery, it did not end racism in the United States.